The first time Ruth bled and it didn't come with a child, her husband Jonah stood stiff as a cedar and did not speak for the rest of the evening. He ate his beans in silence. He left his boots by the door in silence. And when he lay beside her, he faced the wall. They had been married 2 winters. Jonah was a pious, hard-working man. He never raised a hand to her, never cursed, never strayed. But in the eyes of his father, Abraham Carver, a woman who did not make herself useful to a family's future was a woman not worth the meat she ate. Ruth was 19 then, quiet, obedient, slender as a reed and barely louder. Her hands were quick, her back was strong, and her gaze was steady. She could mend a fence, pluck a bird, and quarter an elk without complaint, but none of that mattered to Abraham. He wanted sons, a line. A Carver seed to grow from this dusty, sun-choked patch of Wyoming dirt. The Carver ranch sat on the edge of nowhere, 2 days' ride from Laramie, bordered by dribrush gullies and black hills that swallowed sound. There were no neighbors. No one to witness. Abraham kept the land with an iron spine and harsher tongue. His word was law. His sons followed it like scripture. When the 3rd year passed without a child, Abraham stopped calling Ruth by name. He referred to her as the empty one. He spoke of her in front of her as if she were a mule with a crooked leg. Jonah tried once to defend her. He received a backhand that knocked a tooth loose, and he never tried again. Then one day in early spring, Abraham struck a deal with a traveling trader from the Dakotas, a hard-faced man with 3 teeth and skin like scorched leather. He'd been looking for a strong woman to cook and clean for a mining camp he ran with 5 other men near the Black Hills. "She's Barren," Abraham said, "but she works like a mule and don't talk back." The man squinted at Ruth, who stood in the doorway with blood on her apron and ash on her face from the cook fire. He grunted. "What's she worth?" Abraham named his price, 1 good mule, a barrel of cured meat, and a silver pocket watch. Jonah did not protest. He stood by the barn, hands limp, and stared at the place where Ruth had once hung her laundry. She did not cry, she did not scream. She packed her small satchel with a thimble, 2 spare dresses, and the faded photograph of her mother she kept hidden in her Bible. Then she climbed into the trader's wagon. By dusk, the ranch was no longer hers. They rode west. The trader, Cobb was his name, said little but stared often. He drank rye from a tin flask and spat brown into the dust. The first night, he tried to press his hands between her thighs. She held his own skinning knife to his throat and said, "I ain't a whore." He laughed but backed off. By the 5th day, they reached the edge of the Dakota hills, where the ground rose jagged and the air smelled of iron. The mining camp was worse than she imagined. 6 men in a shanty of splintered wood, flies thick as molasses, piss-stained corners, and beds made of moldy hay. One of the men had half a nose. Another walked with a limp and called her sweet meat when she passed. They thought she'd scream. She didn't. They thought they could break her with labor. They didn't know Ruth Carver had already been broken, buried, and grown back like a thorn bush in drought. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept her knife close. When one of the men tried to slap her for serving cold beans, she broke his thumb with a skillet. No one touched her after that. Winter came early that year. Snow swallowed the passes. The mine dried up, the men grew restless and mean. Cobb blamed her for the bad luck, said she cursed the place with her empty womb. He said it loud, called her names, threw a bottle at her head and missed. The others laughed. That night, Ruth boiled his boots in his own stew pot and threw them out the door. When Cobb came roaring after her with a pickaxe, the widower shot him clean through the chest. The widower's name was Silas Dunn. His cabin was 10 miles north, tucked in the trees like it didn't want to be found. He'd come to the camp for medicine, found her instead. He said nothing for a long time, just stood over Cobb's body, pistol still smoking. Then he looked at Ruth. "You want to die here?" She shook her head. "You can ride with me." She hesitated. He wasn't much to look at. Gaunt, beard thick and ragged, left hand missing 2 fingers, but his eyes weren't cruel, just tired. She said yes. The snow began that night. They rode single file into the white. The cabin was more bones than house. Wind slipped through the cracks in the chinked logs, and the roof sagged under the weight of old storms. But there was firewood stacked by the door, a pot of lard in the corner, and no voices but the wind. That was enough. Silas didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why a woman like Ruth had blood on her hands and silence in her eyes. He gave her the cot and slept on the floor. He showed her where the snares were set, how to load his old Hawken rifle, and which trees bled sap sweet enough to chew. In return, she boiled spruce needle tea for his cough and rubbed turpentine into the knots in his back when he thought she wasn't looking. Days folded into each other like cards in a gambler's hand. The world turned white and still. The woods creaked, animals grew lean. Silence settled between them like a dog at rest. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with hunger, but with a quiet wonder, like a man who'd found a coin in the snow and couldn't quite believe it was gold. She didn't trust it. Men only watched women for 2 reasons, to claim them or to judge them. But Silas did neither. He fixed the hinges on the outhouse so it wouldn't screech. He carved her a hairbrush from pine. He kept the axe sharpened. Once she asked him why he lived alone in a place where trees outnumbered people 1,000 to 1. "My wife died birthing our son," he said, eyes on the fire. He followed her 2 days later. She didn't answer. Some things were like cold iron. You touched them, they burned. They survived the winter. Spring came slow and mean, like a drunk crawling home. When the snow thawed, Ruth planted beans in a patch of black soil behind the cabin. She dug with bare hands, her knuckles split. Silas built a fence to keep out the elk. When she bled again and felt the usual twist of shame, she buried the rags in the creek and said nothing. The first threat came in April. 3 riders from the mining camp, drunk on bad liquor and worse memories, appeared at the edge of the clearing. They called her name, called her worse, said she'd stolen Cobb's property, said they wanted compensation. Silas stood on the porch with the Hawken in his hands and didn't say a word. They laughed. She stood beside him, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He shot the hat off the middle one's head. They left. Later, Ruth found Silas kneeling by the root cellar, hands shaking. He'd killed in war, he told her. Not since, didn't want to again. She didn't pity him. But she sat with him until the tremble passed. Summer brought heat and hornets. The beans sprouted. A doe gave birth behind the cabin, and Ruth watched the fawn take its first steps, legs shaking like reeds. She thought of her own body, still empty, still judged, and turned away before the joy could reach her. One morning, Silas handed her a piece of paper torn from an old ledger. "I'm headed to Fort Bridger for supplies," he said. "Won't be back till next moon. If anything happens, any man comes near, shoot first. Don't wait." She nodded. He didn't say goodbye, just rode out with a sack of pelts and a tin of dried apples. She watched until the trees took him. That night, thunder rolled over the hills. The next day, she saw smoke on the horizon. It wasn't his smoke. By dusk, a man came limping into the clearing, boots worn to the sole, hair matted with pine needles. He held up his hands. "I ain't armed," he called. Ruth aimed the Hawken at his chest. "Then you best stay that way." He smiled with split lips. "Name, Emery, I'm looking for Silas. Said he might take me on as a trapper." She didn't lower the rifle. "He's not here." Emery's eyes flicked to the door. "You his woman." Ruth didn't answer. He sat by the fence and waited. That night she gave him half a bowl of stew and a single blanket on the porch. He shivered, but didn't complain. The next day he helped mend the chicken coop without being asked. His fingers were quick and quiet, like a man used to surviving with less. "I lost a brother in the war," he said while hammering in silence. Silas was with him. Thought I'd find him, see if he'd let me earn my keep. Ruth said nothing. But she didn't send him away. A week passed. Then two. Emery slept in the lean-to, ate what he earned, didn't ask questions. He was careful not to be alone with Ruth, careful not to look too long. She watched him just the same. On the 12th day, Silas returned. He rode in slow, eyes narrowing at the sight of Emery by the woodpile. They stared at each other a long time. Then Silas nodded once, and Emery went back to splitting logs. That night Ruth watched the two men speak in low tones by the fire. Words like graves, debt, and Missouri floated through the smoke. Silas's jaw was tight. Emery looked away often. Something old passed between them, a reckoning maybe. Or a shared guilt. Ruth didn't ask, she had her own ghosts, but she knew this, something had shifted. The cabin was no longer just a refuge, it had become something else. A spark, and sparks, given time and air, could burn. The wolves came down from the mountains in June. Hunger made them bold. They killed 2 goats and left nothing but hoof and blood. Silas set traps. Emery baited them with liver. Ruth buried what was left of the animals with a prayer she didn't say aloud. It was the first sign that the quiet wouldn't last. The second came 3 nights later when Ruth found the letter. She had been sweeping the loft, clearing dust and bat droppings, when she knocked over a tin box tucked behind a rafter. Inside were flint pieces, a broken compass, and folded paper rubbed soft by time. She didn't mean to read it. But the name caught her, Jonah Carver, scrawled in tight, slanted ink. Her blood chilled. The letter was short, a contract of sorts. A promise made in a different state to a man she hadn't seen in over a year. It was signed by Abraham Carver, witnessed by 2 others. It said, "Property exchanged, one Ruth Carver, delivered intact, no further claim of inheritance or conjugal rights. Mule and goods accepted. Transfer complete." There was no mention of her as a wife, no name but hers, marked like cattle. She didn't tell Silas what she found. She folded the letter again and burned it in the stove while the men were outside skinning a fox. That night sleep came in fits. She dreamed of the ranch, the way the wind hissed through dry grass, the squeal of the gate, the sound Jonah made when he cried alone in the shed, thinking she couldn't hear. She woke before dawn. Went to the creek and washed her face until it burned. From then on, the stillness between them was different, not broken, but waiting. The next arrival came on horseback, mid-July. Dust rose like steam as the rider appeared through the cottonwoods, slow and unhurried. He wore a black coat, too fine for the wilderness. His beard was trimmed, his boots shone. He called out before stepping into the clearing, "Mr. Dunn." "My name's Ezra Pike. I'm here for the woman you're keeping." Ruth was chopping wood. She didn't stop. Silas came to the porch, rifle in hand, but didn't raise it. "She ain't kept," he said. "And she don't belong to you." Ezra dismounted with a kind of patient arrogance. He smiled like a man who never lost. "I've been sent by Abraham Carver. The girl was sold under contract, but he didn't know the trader was a fugitive. That nullifies the sale. Mr. Carver wants her returned to Wyoming, says she's his daughter-in-law, claims she's family." Ruth stepped forward, axe in hand. "I buried that name." Ezra tilted his head. "Law says otherwise. Law didn't stop him from selling me like meat." Silas cocked the rifle. Ezra didn't blink. "I'm not here to shoot. I'm here to warn. Carver's coming. He means to take what he says is his. He's hired men. They'll be here before harvest." Ruth felt her stomach twist. Emery stepped out of the trees then, silent as smoke. He'd heard it all. Ezra looked at him, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "You're Silas's charity case," Ezra said. "Didn't think you survived the gallows." Emery said nothing. Ezra mounted again. "Tell her to run if she wants, or dig in, but know this, Carver don't forget debts, and he don't forgive disobedience. He rode off. The silence afterward was brittle, like frost on glass. That night, Ruth didn't eat. She sat by the window and watched the moon rise behind the ridge. Her hands shook only once, when she touched the scar on her hip where Abraham's dog had bitten her when she was 20. Silas didn't speak. He cleaned the rifle and added another log to the fire. Emery sat outside, sharpening knives until the stone bled heat. At midnight, Ruth stood. If he comes, I want to face him myself. Silas looked up. You sure? I want him to see what he made and what he lost. The plan was simple. Use the terrain, lay traps, set decoys. Ruth knew how Carver thought. She knew he liked to burn things to feel in control. She also knew he wouldn't expect her to fight. Over the next weeks, they fortified the cabin. Emery built a second cellar, hidden, dry, large enough for supplies and ammunition. Ruth laid shards of glass beneath the eaves. Silas dug a trench near the trail, wide enough for a horse to break its leg. When the beans came ripe, Ruth harvested them with one hand and held a pistol with the other. They waited. By late August, smoke rose again on the southern ridge. A small camp, not yet moving, not yet ready, but near enough. The storm was coming, and Ruth had no intention of being sold again. The first shot came at dawn. It split the morning quiet like bone under a boot, a warning, a test. From the ridge, smoke rose again, thin, deliberate, curling like a finger. Ruth crouched in the frost-wet grass, one eye on the tree line. She had slept in her clothes, boots on, pistol tucked beneath her belt. Silas was already moving through the underbrush, rifle over his shoulder, steps silent as breath. Emery had taken the west trail before first light. The three of them moved now like limbs of the same body, tight, tense, and waiting to be cut. The second shot came nearer, thudding into the trunk of the pine that marked the edge of the clearing. They're probing, Silas muttered, seeing if we scare easy. We don't, Ruth said. She didn't flinch, she didn't blink. By midday, they counted 5 men circling the cabin. None of them wore badges, but all rode with the practiced ease of killers. 2 bore Henry repeaters. 1 had a scar across his lip like a stitched wound. They didn't speak much, but their formation said everything. Mercenaries, paid to return Ruth like property, paid to spill blood if it came to that. That night, Ruth boiled water. She soaked cloth in vinegar and stuffed glass shards into oilskin satchels, meant to burst when trampled. Emery reinforced the cellar trapdoor and laid bare traps beneath pine needles. Silas oiled the hawken and loaded powder into every chamber. They didn't talk of fear. It had long ago become part of the air they breathed, but Ruth couldn't sleep. She stood by the chicken coop, staring into the dark, and thought of her mother. Miriam Price had been a seamstress in Tennessee, killed by fever when Ruth was 13. Her voice had been soft, but her hands hard with work. You make yourself small, baby girl, she'd whispered once, sewing by candlelight. Small things slip through cracks, big things get crushed. Ruth had taken that lesson like gospel. Now, standing under stars that watched without blinking, she felt a rage bloom in her chest that had no name. She didn't want to slip through anymore. She wanted to be the one who crushed. On the second morning they struck. 1 man approached from the east, alone, arms raised, pretending peace. Ruth saw the second man trailing him in the tall grass, rifle low. She waited until the first was 3 paces from the porch. Then she fired. The shot took him in the gut, folding him in half. The second man lunged up, but Silas dropped him with a clean shot to the neck. Screams echoed from the ridge. Another burst of fire cracked the silence. Emery emerged from the tree line, covered in blood that wasn't his. He dragged a body by the legs and dropped it near the cabin wall. For now, he said. Still 1 left, Ruth replied. Silas squinted at the slope. No, not 1. He pointed. A shadow moved at the ridge crest, then another, then 3 more. Ruth counted 7 new riders. She clenched her jaw. Carver had brought more. By evening, the ridge was crawling with men, a war camp, and at its center, Abraham Carver. She saw him clearly for the first time in nearly 2 years. He had grown leaner, his hair was whiter, but the way he held himself, upright, proud, stiff with purpose, had not changed. Neither had the hatred in his eyes. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply pointed at the cabin. And the siege began. The first volleys came heavy and fast. Bullets shredded the porch posts, shattered windows, punched holes through the cabin walls. Ruth crouched in the hearth corner, loading pistols and handing them off. Emery ducked in and out of the cellar like a fox. Silas knelt behind the water barrel, firing methodically, 1 shot every 30 seconds. No waste, no panic. They held for 3 days. The goats were slaughtered in the crossfire. The bean patch trampled, smoke clung to the rafters, and the cabin stank of blood, sweat, and gunpowder. By the 4th night, Ruth's ears rang from constant gunfire. Her knuckles bled from splinters. She hadn't eaten in 30 hours. She sat beside Silas in the dark. "We can't hold much longer," he said. "Then we don't." He turned to her. She looked him full in the face, voice low, calm. "We don't wait anymore. We take it to them." Emery agreed. He had scouted their flank, found a trail, old mining switchbacks that wrapped around the ridge. If they moved at night, they could circle behind the camp. Ruth nodded. She dressed in black, tied back her hair, and strapped 3 knives to her thighs. She took the skinning blade last, the one Cobb had touched, the one that had tasted blood. At midnight they moved. The climb was steep. Ruth slipped once, caught herself on a root, and tore her palm open. She said nothing. Emery guided them in silence. Silas carried the last of their dynamite, 2 sticks wrapped in burlap, soaked in oil. At the ridge they crouched. Below them, the fire pit, the tents, the rifles leaned against trees. Ruth saw Carver sitting near the largest tent, his boots kicked up, polishing the barrel of his pistol like a priest tending relics. She whispered, "I want him." Silas didn't argue. Emery slipped left toward the ammunition stores. Silas crept to the cookfire. Ruth went straight for the heart. She entered the camp like a shadow. 1 guard turned, too late. Her knife opened his throat in one sweep. She stepped over him, breathing slow. 2 more men sat playing cards near the horses. She struck from behind, fast, silent, deadly. Then she was in the tent. Carver turned, pistol halfway raised. He froze. Recognition split across his face like light through glass. "Ruth," he rasped. She stepped closer, knife in hand. He raised the gun. She knocked it aside and drove the blade through his gut. He gasped, sagging to his knees. "You sold me," she whispered. He coughed blood. "You were useless." She twisted the knife. "I was yours," she said, "and you threw me away." The dynamite blew then, one deafening roar that split the earth. The camp lit up in fire, screams, gunshots, then silence. Carver's body burned. Ruth watched until only ash remained. Then she turned and walked back into the trees, smoke in her hair, blood on her hands, and nothing left to fear. The smoke drifted for 3 days before the wind carried it off into the northern hills. Ruth didn't speak much after the fire. Her voice felt hollow, like a bell long cracked. She slept in short bursts, rifle always within reach, and flinched at footsteps even when they were Emery's or Sila's. The cabin survived, barely. The porch had taken 2 bullets to the crossbeam and leaned west now like a drunk leaning into the wind. The cellar had flooded with blood and melted snow, but they were alive. Silas limped from a splintered calf, and Emery carried a fresh scar across his temple from where a man's blade had nicked bone. Ruth stitched both wounds without trembling. She was steady now. Cold, maybe, but steady. They buried what was left of the mercenaries in shallow graves along the ridge, unmarked. Carver's ashes they left scattered among the pines. Ruth took the silver pocket watch from his tent, the same one he'd once traded her body for, and hung it on the nail above the hearth. She didn't open it, she didn't need to. Emery stood with her when she hung it. Think he knew he'd die out here? He asked. She looked at the flames. He thought he couldn't. The rains came early that year, heavy, unrelenting. They beat down the ash and pulled the last of the blood into the earth. Ruth spent her days mending what she could, ropes, boots, the broken window. She chopped wood until her shoulders burned. She hunted when meat ran low, returning with rabbits and sometimes a deer. She cooked with salt and silence. The men let her be. Then one evening, while cleaning the hawken, she asked Silas, "Why did you shoot Cobb back then?" "You didn't know me." Silas rubbed the side of his jaw, eyes on the dying fire. "I saw a man raise his hand against something he thought was broken. I'd done that once, to a dog, a long time ago. Regretted it every day after." Ruth didn't reply. She just watched the sparks curl into the dark. Days passed. One night she bled again. Alone in the outhouse, she sat and stared at the dark stain, anger rising like heat behind her eyes. She hated how her body betrayed her, how it clung to failure like a shroud. She took the rag, walked to the creek, and pressed it beneath the ice-cold flow until her fingers went numb. She stayed there long after the blood was gone. In the cabin, Silas sat waiting with tea. "I don't want comfort," she snapped. "I didn't bring any." They drank in silence. The next morning, Emery found tracks near the southern trail, bare feet, deep impressions. "Scavenger?" he asked. Ruth shook her head. "Too clean, too deliberate." That afternoon they found the boy. He was 10, maybe 11. Skin pale from cold, one eye swollen shut, arms scraped raw. He'd been living off roots and creek water, holed up in a hollowed cedar. When Ruth stepped near, he growled like a dog. She crouched, hands low. "I won't hurt you," she said. "You're safe." He didn't answer, just stared at the axe on her belt. Silas built a fire. Emery offered jerky. Eventually, the boy ate. It took days before they learned his name, Tomas. His mother had been killed by raiders, his father gone long before. He had no one. Nothing but the rags on his back and a rusted knife he kept tucked in his boot. Ruth watched him move through the cabin like a ghost, startled by laughter, frightened by kindness. She recognized it. She'd worn that same look once. "You want him to stay?" Silas asked her one night. She didn't answer for a long time. Finally, "He already has." Tomas slept near the hearth. Ruth made him a blanket from rabbit pelts. She taught him to gut fish and how to hold a knife with purpose. He never cried, not once. But some nights she heard him muttering in his sleep, words twisted by fear and fever. She sat beside him when he did. No lullabies. No comfort, just presence. Spring returned with the sound of birdsong and new green buds along the creek. Ruth stood barefoot in the soil, eyes closed, hands streaked with dirt and ash. She felt something deep in the earth, like the slow breath of a beast that had been sleeping too long. Silas planted potatoes. Emery built a second smokehouse. Tomas laughed once when Ruth slipped in the mud. She didn't scold him. She laughed too. Then came the rider. Early morning, pale fog over the hills. He wore a cavalry coat, rifle across his back. Dust clung to his beard like grief. He bore a badge, but not a sheriff's. A federal sigil, too clean for these woods. He didn't smile. "I'm looking for Ruth Carver," he said. Ruth stepped forward. "You found her." "I'm not here for arrest," he said. "I'm here for a statement." "About what?" "Carver's death, the mercenaries, what happened on that ridge." Ruth didn't answer. She just looked past him, at the trees, the cabin, Tomas sharpening sticks with a blunt blade, Silas repairing the fence, Emery stirring the ash pit. She looked back at the man. "They came to take me." He nodded. "And you fought." "I ended it." He took out a ledger. "You understand, we need records." She crossed her arms. You write what you want, but you won't find a crime here. The man nodded again, slow. Then he said, there's a bounty on Emery Dunn in Missouri, $25. Silas stiffened. Ruth didn't flinch. If Missouri wants him, they can come find him. The man folded the ledger, tipped his hat. He didn't ride fast, didn't need to. That night, Ruth stood on the porch and watched the horizon. There would be others. There were always others. But she was not the girl who'd been sold for a mule. She was something else now. And whatever came next, she would meet it with steel. Summer passed with the pace of old age, hot, slow, heavy with things unspoken. The hills turned gold, then brittle. Ruth began to forget the sound of screams. She spent mornings teaching Tomas how to track deer scat, how to read a man's gait in mud, how to string a line so the fish never saw it coming. She didn't talk much about Wyoming or Abraham, or the years she had spent obeying men who saw her as function, not flesh. But sometimes, when the wind came down from the ridge just so, she'd pause, go still. And she'd remember it all, the trade, the silence, the sound Cobb made when he hit the ground, not with longing, not with fear, with the clarity of someone who had walked out the other side. Silas built her a table. It took him a week and one split thumb. He carved her initials beneath it in small, shaky letters, RC. She traced them once and said nothing, but when she cooked the next night, she laid out an extra plate, for him, always for him. Emery took to trapping like instinct. He rarely spoke of Missouri or the gallows waiting there. But once, by the creek, Ruth asked him if he meant to run when the next lawman came. No, he said. I buried that part of me up on that ridge. Ruth nodded. Good, then if they come, we'll bury them too. Autumn brought storms. The wind tore half the shingles from the roof and drowned their beats in standing water, but they patched the holes. They dried what they could. Silas fell sick for 3 days, and Ruth fed him honey boiled with pine needles and wiped his sweat with a cloth she'd once kept for Sunday prayers. Tomas found a dog. Half-starved, blind in one eye, ribs like bowed wood, he called it Needle. Ruth tried not to care, but one night she found the dog curled by her bed and she left it there. They did not talk of love. It was not that kind of house. But they stayed. That was love enough. Winter came brutal. The snow stacked high, and the wind screamed through the pines like the dead wanting back in. They lost a hen to frost. A lantern shattered in a sudden gust and nearly set the front room alight. Tomas coughed for a week, and Ruth sat beside him, hand to his back, whispering old hymns she barely remembered the tune for. No riders came, no law. No carver name dragging behind a gunstock, only silence, only fire, only the pulse of something growing in the dirt beneath them. In January, Ruth took to walking past the ridge each morning. She marked the graves, counted stones. 7 crosses, 1 ash heap. She kicked the frost from their bases. She stood over Abraham's blackened ground and said nothing. But one morning she brought a seed, a single kernel saved from last year's beans. She dug a shallow hole in the dead center of the ash and placed it there, buried it with her bare hands. When she returned to the cabin, Silas was at the stove, Tomas snoring in the loft, Needle twitching in dreams. Ruth hung up her coat and looked out the window again. Snow falling, nothing else moved. She smiled, not with joy, but with something harder, something earned. The last thaw came late that year. Ice cracked and ran down the hill like blood. Tomas turned 12. Emery built a second cabin near the creek. Silas carved Ruth a stool and wrote her name beneath it too. They planted more beans, more carrots. Ruth stood barefoot in the thawed soil and felt it, soft, rich, waiting. And beneath it something took root, not just a seed, something deeper, something permanent. She was not the girl who had waited on a husband's silence. Not the wife traded like stock, not the thing that bled each month and waited for shame to pass. She was Ruth Carver no longer. She was Ruth, the woman who had burned her past to ash and fed her future with it. One night, as the last snow turned to rain, Silas asked her, "You still think about them?" She didn't ask who, she knew who he meant. She stared into the fire and said, "They're part of the soil now." And they were. Come spring, the beans sprouted in the ash on the ridge, green against gray, living proof that even from ruin something could rise, something that would not be moved.